So next up, we're going to have a panel discussion about kind of the virtual interview process, virtual match process. So we have a great panel of experts in the field, both representing recent applicants who've gone through the experience as well as program leaders. Let's just have you each introduce yourself, if that's okay. We'll zip down the line. Sarah.
All right, I'm Sarah Krasaniak. I'm the program director at Stanford, and despite the fact that Gannon and I go way back, he still likes to add an H to my name. So if you try to look me up or try to find me, I mean, there aren't a lot of like Sarah Krasaniaks that you're going to get me confused with.
I got both Z's.
You do get both Z's. That's actually the harder part. But yeah, program director at Stanford.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jack Sparts. My name is spelled correctly. Thankfully, I'm an incoming intern at Denver Health, but I'm still a medical student at Tulane. What's up, Paul?
Hi, I'm Melinda Kazaya. I am an intern at Ohio State's emergency medicine program.
And last but not least, and I'm pretty sure my name's spelled right, but I can't see that well. If it's not, my Twitter handle is up there, and that is correct. So. My name is Cassandra Bradby. I am the residency program director at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina.
So I have some questions to ask the panelists, but I also want to make sure that this is informal and you all are going to be going through this experience. So feel free to raise your hand and engage in the conversation. I guess I'd start with Sarah and Cassandra with the perspective of non-virtual in-person application seasons. How do you feel that this has been different in terms of your ability to assess applicants through a virtual lens versus in person?
You want to go first?
So my hospital is in a rural-ish area. Technically, if you look up Greenville, it's a city, an urban area, which is mind-boggling to me. But it's like right in the middle of a bunch of rural everything. So I gotta admit, I really enjoyed the virtual interview season, mostly because I felt like more folks were able to come talk to us without having to do the extensive travel to come to Greenville, which is not that far from Raleigh. It's like 90 minutes from Raleigh, but like I remember what it was like to be a medical student and have to interview all over the country and drive places and rent cars and blah blah, none of which would be fun in this current environment, mind you. So I think the virtual match process, I think, was helpful for the past 2 years for that alone. But one of the things that I thought was a little bit harder is if you're not from like a smaller town, like trying to get a feel of like what our city is like was, I think, a lot harder for people than it would have been otherwise. But getting a feel for people, I think, was not so bad. Because to be honest, during your interview season, you're going to meet with each person 10 to 20, 30 minutes, depending on an interview day. The thing that you get in person is you get like maybe more of the feels from being present in the space, but like the amount of time you spent with each person, conversations aren't really any different. You still, like, because there's like a screen business, you still get to see people and mannerisms and stuff like that. The things I missed out on were getting to see how you interact with each other a little bit better and how you interact with my staff, because now you're not running into people in the hallway anymore. You're only talking to whoever's on the screen, that kind of thing. I will say, like, some of the most entertaining candidates were the ones who were like waiting for their next interview with other people, and they're like, hey, how's it going? How's your interview season going? Like, have you guys done this? Like, blah, 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 blah. And like, our residency coordinator was like super jazzed about that. She's like, that person was so engaging, and they were like so all about like talking to other people and stuff. Like, they would be lots of fun if they came here. And that was something that I didn't expect to get feedback on, because like I'm not in that space because I'm busy doing other things like talking to folks. But I will say, like, if you're someone who's like super like chatty Cathy in the space, it does get noticed. So I think maybe that gave our residency coordinator a better feel for you. I think she had less feel for folks this year because it wasn't in person, maybe more so than I did. But I think those were the biggest differences.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I agree. You know, as program director, I'm spending 10 minutes with every applicant. So my ability to assess applicants with a 10-minute in-person versus virtual is pretty much the same. I agree there's some intangibles that we miss, and I know the impact on applicants is greater, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I actually feel like I still got to know people pretty well through that 10-minute interview process.
Before we pivot to applicants, you mentioned kind of the loss of ability to relay culture about your own program to applicants with losing the in-person opportunity. How did each of you within your programs kind of try to address that or fill that gap in terms of showing the culture of your program in a virtual sense?
Yeah, that's really challenging. We put a lot of effort into our online presence, our online media. We added a lot of videos. We added new websites for our applicants. Online virtual interviews with our residents, or videos where they talk about different things. So we had all of our residents who are parents put together a video so our applicants could go on and hear their perspective. A walkthrough of our department that was led by residents so they could weigh in and chime in on what it's like to work in our department. It is really challenging to get that culture piece across, though, and I think that's probably the biggest thing that gets lost in the virtual process. But we did put a lot of effort into our media in order to try to give applicants that.
We did several of the virtual meet and greets leading up until the interview season, and then the week of your interview you can meet with however many residents come to a virtual kind of meet and greet, answer questions kind of thing where there's no faculty present, so they will tell you their actual opinions. And so I think that was helpful. But I think the thing that got lost the most, I think you got to understand where the residents are from and what kind of people they are, and whether maybe you feel you would fit in with them or not. You could get that vibe, but I don't think that you could understand what it was like to truly live in Greenville. I love Greenville, for the record. I've been there 8 years, so I'm making it sound bad, but I'm really not trying to. Which isn't part of my problem. But I think that as someone who moved from New York City, it would be really hard for you to understand what living in rural North Carolina is like, no matter how we explain it to you. So I think I personally will tell you, I think it was helpful if you did your interviews, you figured out, I really liked these people. I think they were mad cool, but I have no clue where the heck that place is. Road trip, road trip, because I think you need to see where you're going to be when you're not in the hospital. I think you got a good understanding of the hospital and the job, but maybe not a great understanding of what it was like when you didn't have to be in the building.
And I want to talk a little bit about visits or in-person visits after interviews, but to Jack and Melinda, of the efforts that I think many programs have done to try to show culture through the virtual presence, what worked, what didn't work, what did you find valuable?
I will say, I think even the climate between when I went through the match last year, when COVID was still very fresh and things were much more strict, is very drastically different than the experience he probably had. I will say last year, the kind of social media space and the presence that programs were trying to have was a little different. I would say Instagram worked really well. I've always been big on Twitter. I've loved Twitter for a long time, so I was familiar with Twitter, but I think a lot of people aren't yet in the med student world. So Instagram, I think, was the big hitter of making the fun videos, doing the stories where you could see a life or a day in the life of a resident. Those things were really appealing to me and did help me see the culture a little more, as well as showing their conference days. You could kind of see how they structured those things, the content they were preparing. That was very helpful for me.
Yeah, I think was with a year to kind of polish everything. When I came into it, everyone had their whole spread of how we're going to approach it. And so what ended up happening is every single program had pretty much the exact same materials that I was looking at. So it was more about comparing individual programs against each other because everyone was on the same playing field. They all had the video, they all had the pre-interview social, they all had the interview, they all had their Instagram and their Twitter, etc. And so I think from my perspective, what I ended up doing was just taking a really critical view of the words they chose to use, the mission they chose to highlight, the people they chose to highlight, what they talked about in the 7 minutes that they give their Vimeo presentation, what they talk about when the PD gets up there and gives their presentation. And then, did the residents, when they showed up, talk about how often they go out to bars or how often they go climbing together? Or did they talk mostly about hey, do you have any clinical questions? It gives you a sense of what their priorities are or maybe what is cultivated resident to resident. and cultivated with the faculty as well.
I want to talk a little bit about the kind of pre-interview season events. I get anxiety when I look at that calendar that goes around each year of 8 hours of virtual sessions every night of your summer, which is not a busy time at all if you're applying to emergency medicine residencies. So I guess for Melinda and Jack, did you find those valuable? Did you feel pressure to attend? And then for our program leadership, did you feel that people's attendance mattered to you as the recruitment season played out?
I would say, again, I think this is something that really changed over the last year. I think last year when I was going through it, it was so unknown and it was so foreign and really scary. None of us knew, is this going to work out for us? I think it led to more over-application and the additional stress that oh, crap, I have to go to all of these things, and if I don't, I might not match. So last year, for sure, I felt the pressure. I was always on Zoom. I definitely was fatigued. My calendar was as full as it could possibly be. I can't speak from personal experience, I hope that this year's class saw, hey, this worked out for most people. It was weird and it was scary, but it worked out for them, so maybe that pressure lessened a little bit. He'll be able to speak more to that, but I would say the pressure was definitely on. It's very stressful. I would advise you to not stretch yourself that thin if the match is virtual again this year, and just try to choose wisely, pick which ones you really want to be at, which ones you're actually going to be really engaged with, and you're going to get the most bang for your buck that way.
That's the advice to take. I was definitely anxious and went to everything that I could, feasibly make, because I was worried that they were taking notes, that they were seeing who's going to what and what's going to differentiate me and how do I stand out and all these things. There were some programs that were nice enough to say, we don't care who's there, we're not taking notes, this is just for you, etc. They were very explicit about it. Others didn't really say anything, so you kind of had this unknown, uncertain, are they really critically appraising me via this? But I think they helped for the programs that you're considering, or maybe kind of on the verge of considering, because they give you an idea of what they care about in a broad sense, and it's almost the easiest way to get an idea of what a program cares about or what it's going to offer you. So it helped me differentiate between academics, county, and community very quickly, and really guided my application process through that.
From the PD standpoint, and I think I can't imagine that there are a lot of programs that take attendance and are well, Jack showed up to our Q&A, so therefore point in his column. We definitely didn't quantitatively take note of who attended ours, and truly we want all of our sessions to be for you to learn about our program, knowing that it is challenging to do that. And honestly, a lot of our content repeats itself because we know that not everyone can show up on July 8th at 7 p.m. So we usually structure ours with a little portion on the application season, but then just the nuts and bolts about our program. And so you don't have to come every single time because you're just going to hear my same spiel over and over again, which gets really tiring for me as well as applicants that sit through it. That being said, we definitely had people where that person's back again. It was good to see that, that face. So we do recognize who's there, but I wouldn't, with all of the stressors that you have as very busy medical students, I wouldn't show up just for the sake of showing up. Find the ones that are actually going to accomplish something for you, and then go to those.
I agree with that assessment, but I will add the caveat that we did take attendance, not the way you think we did. So it wasn't a so-and-so's here, let me write that down. It was because of Zoom bombing and whatnot, you had to sign up to get the Zoom link, which meant we inadvertently took attendance, which wasn't necessarily the intention. But I will tell you that one of my current interns got an interview because he showed up to so many things, and we didn't realize that he showed up to so many things. But the reason is that he's from Oregon, and I am in North Carolina. And he has zero ties to North Carolina. And so I'm not positive that I would have interviewed him if he hadn't already showed so much interest in coming to hang out with us, because if I had just seen it, I think otherwise I'd have been now why is someone from Oregon who grew up in the Pacific Northwest and has never left it, are they really coming here? Yeah. And he's super jazzed about it, but I'm not positive I would have had another way to know that. Except this year, apparently, y'all are going to get the opportunity to tell us that, in it, like through this preference signaling thing that we're not going to talk about right this second, but same concept.
But I think that's a super important point, is that I think the pressure, hopefully the pressure for some of those sessions, particularly to the programs that y'all signal, you won't necessarily, it doesn't matter if you didn't show up to my virtual session in August. If you gave us one of your 5 limited preference signals, that probably trumps.
In fairness, we also make you register. So in transparency, you're right. We got Zoom bombed, which was both horrifying and also really flattering. Like, I sort of felt like we'd made it. Right? I was like,
Zoom bombed.
oh, like, wow, this is really frightening. But we do. So yeah, so in case anyone comes to our things and we're like, we were at SAEM and she said they don't take attendance. We do actually make you register, but it's not I don't see that list anywhere. It's just for my coordinators to make sure that we're trying to have some safeguards.
I have a couple more questions, and I want to make sure we leave some time for the audience. To Jack and Melinda, the actual process of virtual interviews. So on the day, what do you wish you knew at the beginning of the process that you have learned from experience having gone through it? Like, what do you feel like was clumsy or awkward, or that you improved upon over the course of doing a bunch of virtual interviews?
Well, I would say we all want to go into emergency medicine or are in emergency medicine. You have to be able to adapt to anything and just kind of roll with it. So one of my very first interviews last year, an actual wasp was in my office and like flying around my head, landed on my shoulder, and I'm like in the interview with the program director for this interview. And I was trying to play it really cool and be like, it's fine, everything's fine. But no, really, it wasn't fine. And so finally, I just had to stop and say, I'm really sorry. There is actually a wasp flying around my head. And he laughed, I laughed, it was fine. I think you just have to like remember that you're a human and just enjoy the process. And it's really hard to do that. But I would say I was so nervous in the beginning. And then by the end of it, you're just kind of like, you're here, I'm here, we're on Zoom, it just is what it is, and just be yourself. So try to like relax a little bit more and not try to put on this like facade of perfection, because it doesn't exist, and your dog is gonna bark, your kid's gonna walk through the room, like it's life, and I think we have to be real with that.
Anyone else picturing Tommy Boy?
Yeah.
That's how I was picturing. Good for you for playing that off. Okay.
I don't think I have anything very profound outside of what was already said, but I do think shut off your camera when they tell you you have an opportunity to. You sit in a normal interview, you get to walk and talk and move around and be present. And in this, you're in a chair without, it's stable, so you don't get to swivel or anything like that. You're in a suit, and definitely wear pants. Don't play games. It's not very fun. And you're sitting there for sometimes, I think that my longest one was 7 hours. So you're sitting there like this the whole time, and your shoulders start to hurt, your back starts to hurt, you're like taking ibuprofen. So when they give you a chance, turn off the camera and like go do your things, enjoy yourself. But I would say after the interview, the thing that I learned that I missed the first couple ones is you will forget so quickly how you felt after the interview. So record yourself, write down notes, do whatever you feel comfortable doing to remember that sort of gestalt, that gut feeling you had there, and some of the things you really liked about it, because that's really going to come into play later.
That's great advice. When we interviewed, I had a dictaphone, and I actually, just recorded my thoughts on a place, and that was so helpful because they run together, and I'm sure with the virtual interview, it's even kind of worse because you don't even have like a visual.
It's always your living room.
Yeah, it's Groundhog Day. Yeah, you're just waking up in the same place. Yeah.
I will tell you, do not take notes on your computer during the interview because when you type on your laptop, because that's what we all have at this point, the screen does like this. And like, as the person interviewing you, that is distracting as all get out. So like, if you can find a way to like have a separate keyboard and maybe nobody will know, do that. But like, definitely do not have your computer on like the little riser thing and type in it, because it will do this.
So more of that for Sarah and Cassandra. What did people do well in virtual interviews? What did people not do well? How did applicants distinguish themselves in good and bad ways?
You got to make your bed, okay? If you're doing, I can't tell you like the number of people that would, I mean, it wasn't a lot, but like that would show up, and I think we're all very like sensitive to the fact that not everybody has like a super professional background or a place to do it. So we have people that were like doing it in their bedroom, but like make the bed behind you, like people that were just like disheveled and I don't know, it just is like not a great look. So just remember that there is a background. 2 years ago, we actually gave people a virtual background that they could use in case, like there were situations where people didn't have a background. And then that got super awkward because there'd be like one person that showed up with our like Stanford supplied Zoom background, and then they looked like a total, suck up. Which was, I was like, oh, that's so awkward, and we felt really bad. But everybody at this point, I think, knows how to use a virtual background. So, just be cautious. You don't want to be the one that's like, oh, that was the guy with his bed unmade. But otherwise, again, I think like being engaging, as Cassandra said, like, we try to be very clear, like this is a time for you to have your camera off. You shouldn't be pressured to like be there and be engaging, but there are like, we have residents in our waiting room, our virtual waiting room, that's your opportunity to engage and talk. So just remember, like anytime your camera is on, you're on just like in a real interview. People see you and observe you and know like what you're saying and what you're talking about.
The mute button is your friend. It is your friend. Mm-hmm. Make sure that it is on. If you've turned your that you turned your camera off and you decided to, I don't know, go to the bathroom, say something crazy to your spouse, yell at the dog, that kind of stuff, like turn mute. The other thing is like, don't worry so much about like the random stuff. Like Melinda was saying, like if your dog shows up, cool. If you're like, no one cares. Like it's your life. But that being said, know what is in your background. Like don't. If it's an unfamiliar place to you, turn the camera on beforehand and so you can see what's behind you, because it ends up being like a source of conversation. So like if you have Ruth Bader Ginsburg behind you, someone's gonna ask about that. Like, so unless you were prepared to have that conversation, put it to the side. Which book choices you have behind you, the art behind you. I've had many a conversation about like the artwork that's on the wall. Because half the time it's somebody's an artist and they like did their own art or whatever. So like I'll ask about that. So just know what is back there. It can be nothing back there. That's cool. But if there's something back there, just be aware you are likely to be asked about it. Also, Zoom your family, whoever, anybody who's going to be honest with you before you do your actual interview season, so that you can know there's buzzing in the background. The light hits you in the face in a weirdo way so that like you're squinting like this, like half the interview. Because you
Cameras
don't
up your nose.
Yeah, like I see all your nose hairs right now because like your angle is weird. That kind of stuff, like it's an easy thing to do for someone to give you feedback on before you have to meet with someone who probably, honest to God, doesn't care, but you feel like they do. So you might as well like get that stuff out of the way early.
And then last question for Jack and Melinda. We kind of touched on this at the beginning, but did you visit the place that you ultimately matched to? Did you visit other programs? Did you feel a need to go see the place in person, or were you drawn to places that you had prior experience to? Was there an in-person component to your recruitment season?
Last year, that was like an absolute no. COVID was still really rampant. That time last year, so there was no, like, you're not coming here, there's no traveling, it's not going to happen. I tried to schedule rotations at the programs I was most interested in, and that worked out for me because I did want to stay local in Ohio. But that was kind of very frowned upon last year. We all know about the spreadsheets, we all know about the conversations people have. And if you had gone somewhere and like seen a program when everybody else wasn't, it was actually very frowned upon. I think that's different this year. Things have gotten better, and it's certainly different. But my experience last year was like hard no. There's no visiting.
Yeah, I think one beauty of virtual interviews is the cost of them, as in mostly $0. So you get to save a ton of money that you otherwise would have spent flying out already. So while there are definitely financial barriers to getting out, and not everyone can get out and visit places due to time constraints, financial constraints, if you're in your first or second year and you're in this room right now, I highly recommend squirreling away a little bit of money to afford maybe your top 2 or 3 programs where you're competitive and you're really interested and you haven't been there before. Because I got to go see a few of my tops, and it really gave me a sense of the place I was going to live. And it gave me kind of a vision for the future of what would it be like to live in a house or an apartment nearby. You know, what's my commute look like? Where are the restaurants I'm going to eat at? What am I going to do for fun? All of those things are really, they were, I think, the most important thing, besides maybe the feeling of the program and how welcome I ended up feeling at certain places. That was the next most important component. So if you can travel, it really helped me. I think it can help you, especially if you start planning now financially.
So I was selfish and took up most of our time, but I want to give a few minutes at least to the audience if we have questions.
Can I follow yours up? Because I think this is one that other people are thinking. When you visited, did you make contact with the program?
I did not. I felt that I think it's a privilege to be able to travel there. And while you would have had to go anyway, I do think it's still coming from a place of financial and time privilege. And so in that spirit, I went for me, not for the program. So I did not share with anyone that I was traveling there. I didn't go tour anything. I didn't take any significant advantage, but that was a very conscious choice on my part. I don't know if it's the right thing to do necessarily or the wrong thing to do. So I would recommend asking either your advisor or, even, other people that are going through it this year, since it's so much more open.
And last year, the COPA guidelines recommended strongly against any in-person contact with programs. It is almost certain that guidance will not exist this year, and so I think it'll be kind of a free-for-all in terms of how this looks. That's my own personal.
Yeah, I would say I think
prediction.
programs are trying to figure out what we're going to do about in-person opportunities. Like, we would love to do an in-person second look. Last year, we were told by our institution, really strictly following COPA, any interaction between the program and the applicant was considered violating that policy. So we were not allowed, if someone came into town, to, even if Jack had reached out to say I'm in town, we wouldn't have been able to meet. But we're really hoping that there will be something virtual. CORD should be dropping their recommendations. We're thinking after this meeting, after SAEM, because I think they had a board meeting. That's my guess, is that we'll get some guidance.
This is also a great time to use the residents. As a program director, I actually don't want to know that you're in town, because that's time for you to figure out what you want. And again, like Jack said, that comes from also a place of privilege, and I think it's not fair that if you couldn't afford to come, that you get shafted because you couldn't afford to come. So I actually don't want to know, and so if you ask me, I'll tell you we have a no visiting policy. But if you go ask the residents, and the residents will be like, oh, you're coming to town, we'll go meet you at such and such place, and tour you around or whatever. But I never need to know that. So I know that there are people who came to visit this year, but I had no clue when they were there, and I'm not entirely sure who came. But I know that people came because they were hanging out. So.
Other questions from the group?
There was somebody back there that had a question.
Yeah, I'm back, Jack. You talked about getting to know the program in person and going to see the area. Virtually, it's hard to do, obviously. What questions do you ask program directors and residents to get to know the program a little better? Having those residents share later on something like
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question, and I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have a great list to go forward with or to give you. I think there's a lot of great resources online to get ideas for questions, but what I will say is that there are some filler questions that don't really make a difference at the end of the day, like how do you run trauma? What are you doing with your airways? That did not come into an equation for me or most of my colleagues from us talking about it. A lot of the questions that made a bigger difference was asking questions about the relationships between residents, the relationships between faculty and residents. And what it gives you is, it's a more difficult question to answer, but it also gives you kind of a deeper insight when someone says, oh, well, I had an issue with the residency and I'm a second year resident and I went to my PD and 2 weeks later, we actually came up with a solution. That was 3 months ago. That's a discrete, great example of what's going on versus the other answer, which is, we definitely are heard. And you're like, oh, okay. It's a little bit different, right? I don't know if I trust you on that. So I think there's clever ways of going about analyzing what you care about most at programs. So I would recommend just starting to think about that as you move into the season, as you learn what you care about with each program, what your narrative is, why you want to go into emergency medicine. Find questions that relate to that, and really put the pressure on the PDs.
Add to that really quickly. Things that matter to me include food. And so one thing that I did to kind of get a gauge on the culture, I would ask every program, it's 2 a.m., everyone on shift is starving, where are we getting takeout from? And that, like, people will kind of chime in and be like, oh yeah, that one time so-and-so ordered pizza for everyone, we really like that. Or like, where's your favorite post-night shift brunch spot? And if a lot of people answer and they have a lot of ideas, that means that, like, okay, they truly do hang out outside of work. A lot of the residents do get together. They do have fun. But if they're kind of like, oh, well, we haven't, oh, I don't know, then it kind of just, so like find something that you care about and find like that fun way to make it a conversation piece while also getting some information of like, what do they do for fun? Are they actually friends, or is this just kind of fake?
Awesome. I think maybe one more question, and then in the interest of time, we'll move on.
Because of like the virtual interviews, did you all, I guess, feel more pressure to like schedule more than you needed to, and how did that work out? And how did you balance that? Because I guess if you get more interviews than you need, how did you handle that?
Yeah, so last year, this was definitely a big fear, and I would say I probably did schedule more than I needed to. There were multiple factors for that, but I did have a hard cutoff going into it. I looked at my stats. I was very honest with myself. I spoke to my advisors and said, what do I need to do in this climate to be successful? So you have to do that assessment as well and be honest with yourself. There is that pressure though, and I think at some point you have to look at the big picture and the camaraderie involved with this process. And if you have all of these interviews, there's somebody who's struggling and doesn't have even half that. And so I think in the spirit of being a good team player and a good future resident, you have to just, one, be honest with yourself, but also be honest with like the environment and the climate of the situation. And you can't hog all the interviews. It's hard, but you have to do it.
I also had a hard cutoff, and a lot of it was based on camaraderie and allowing for everyone to have access to a sufficient amount of interviews to really demonstrate themselves and get into a program, because they're going to be your colleagues and they're going to be in emergency departments around the country soon. So yeah, I definitely reiterate that component. I think working with your advisor to see what that number is, they have a much better idea today than they did in her class. And I think for me even, I was told a number that I wasn't necessarily comfortable with, because it didn't feel like what everyone else was doing on like whatever sites I horribly perused. Yeah, definitely recommend against that.
Don't do it.
So I think the pressure is on to take as many as you can. I don't think it's necessary, and I also think that there's a component of selflessness and camaraderie that will go a long way in setting you up this season.
I'll just quickly add that from the program standpoint, I would much rather have you cancel an interview with us. If you decide that like Northern California isn't for you, and you weren't sure at the beginning of the season, and then maybe you were pulled off the wait list at some places closer to home, and that's where you really want to be. With it being virtual, we have applicants every year that are like, I will come with like 12 hours notice. I can be free. So we, within reason, 24 hours is probably like the appropriate I don't know, every program should on their website say, but like I would much rather have you cancel and say, you know what, like I just don't want to come to Stanford in Northern California. Perfect. Like I've got a wait list of people that would really love to have an interview. So I think, prior when people had to travel, it was really horrible to have last minute cancellations because then you ended up with open spots that you couldn't fill. That's not the case now. I will also just say, just because I can't not say this, the online sites, like the spreadsheets, just really proceed with caution because there is a lot of wrong information on there. I would pop on every now and then just to be like, I wonder what's like out there. And there would be things like, actually, I looked at someone, like an applicant put their like rank list and like where they were putting programs, and they listed Stanford. And like I looked at this person's stats. I was like, there is 0% chance that we interviewed this person. Like those stats just did not align with someone that we interviewed. But they like put out there that Stanford was on their rank list. So people put things out there that aren't true. They troll programs. They'll like, to make them like improve their chances to match high. They'll be like, oh, this program sucks, so that you put it lower. It's just very crazy. So please, like, those are not like the beaming light of truth about any program.
Cool. I think with that we'll end. Thank you to our panelists.